A quiet neighborhood hides a secret that will leave you stunned. One loyal dog, known for its gentle heart, turns a routine day into a whirlwind of mystery and emotion. When the neighbor's kittens start disappearing, whispers spread like wildfire. But no one ever imagined that the friendly dog, always by the owner's side, would be at the center of it all. In a series of events that seem almost too wild to be true, the dog embarks on a mission that defies expectations. Every moment builds up to a dramatic revelation, showing that even in the simplest acts, courage and compassion can flourish. What drove this pet to take such a daring step? The answer is hidden in layers of loyalty and love, a tale that challenges our ideas of right and wrong. Stay with us as we unravel the mystery behind these unexpected actions. In a peaceful neighborhood where everyone knew each other, life moved at a gentle pace. The streets were lined with neat houses, vibrant gardens, and friendly smiles that greeted you at every corner. Here, the sound of warm chatter and the occasional bark of a pet filled the air, creating a comforting sense of community. In this close-knit environment, every animal had its own tale, but one story was about to capture the hearts of all who heard it. At the heart of this unfolding tale was a kind and loyal dog named Charlie. Charlie was known far and wide for his calm presence and warm eyes that seemed to hold unspoken stories. Every day, he would greet his owner with boundless enthusiasm and follow them around like a devoted shadow. More than just a pet, Charlie was a silent guardian who had earned the trust and admiration of everyone in the neighborhood. His quiet nature and gentle demeanor made him a familiar and cherished figure on the block. Not far from Charlie's home lived Mrs. Patterson, a kind-hearted elderly neighbor with a radiant smile. Mrs. Patterson had a special place in her heart for animals, and she had adopted a litter of playful kittens that filled her small home with joy. These tiny creatures were the light of her life. Each day, she spent countless hours feeding them, watching them tumble over one another, and marveling at their curiosity as they explored every nook and cranny of her garden. The kittens' soft purrs and lively antics brought laughter and a sense of wonder to her days. However, as time went on, something unusual began to occur. One by one, the kittens started to disappear. At first, it was only one missing here or there, and no one gave it much thought. But gradually, the numbers increased, and concern began to ripple through the neighborhood. Whispers and puzzled looks became common as neighbors exchanged theories about the sudden vanishing of these small, cherished lives. Charlie, the gentle dog with the perceptive eyes, soon found himself at the center of these curious events. On many tranquil afternoons, he was spotted wandering near Mrs. Patterson's house, the very place where the kittens once played freely. His once innocent visits, full of simple curiosity, now carried a hint of mystery and urgency. Some neighbors recalled seeing him return with something unusual in his mouth, although no one could definitively say what it was. Questions began to swirl. Was Charlie meddling in the kittens' disappearance, or was he trying to protect them? In the midst of this growing mystery, subtle clues about Charlie's behavior began to surface. His owner, who had always admired his loyalty, mentioned that Charlie seemed to act as if he was trying to send a silent message. There were moments when his eyes shone with a deep focus, as if he were trying to communicate a secret only he understood. Friends and family began sharing personal stories of times when Charlie had reacted unusually during moments of distress, each tale reinforcing the belief that his actions were guided by an instinct to protect. As the puzzle deepened, more members of the community started piecing together observations. Some neighbors noticed that Charlie often lingered near spots where the kittens had once roamed freely. His gentle and cautious nature did not align with that of a pet causing harm. Instead, it hinted that he might have been trying to rescue them from an unseen danger. Rumors spread of a hidden threat lurking in the shadows of the neighborhood, a danger that only a perceptive animal like Charlie could sense. Adding to the intrigue, children in the community saw these events as part of an exciting adventure. Their innocent imaginations painted Charlie as a secret hero on a noble mission, a guardian of the small and vulnerable. They believed that every wag of his tail and every determined step he took was part of a grand plan to shield the kittens from harm. While their views were touched with whimsy, even the adults could not ignore the underlying emotion, a mix of admiration, concern, and curiosity about the remarkable bond between the pet and his unsuspecting charge. As more details emerged, the neighborhood began to reframe their understanding of the situation. Charlie's nightly excursions were no longer seen as acts of mischief, but as courageous attempts to secure safety for those who could not fend for themselves. The once puzzling disappearances of the kittens started to look like deliberate relocations to safer spots within Mrs. Patterson's garden, areas away from lurking dangers. There was talk among the residents that perhaps there was a hidden peril, a stray animal or an environmental hazard, that had prompted Charlie to take such drastic measures. Neighbors began recounting small yet significant details. The way Charlie would pause at a familiar bush, his ears perked up as if listening for distant sounds, or the careful way he nudged a frightened kitten towards a secure corner. Each observation added a layer of depth to the unfolding narrative. It became clear that Charlie's actions were driven by an innate sense of duty and love, a bond that transcended simple pet behavior. In this evolving story of loyalty, resilience, and hidden dangers, the community found itself both captivated and grateful. They began to see Charlie not as a troublemaker, but as a silent sentinel, a brave creature whose actions were fueled by love and an extraordinary sense of protection. With every mysterious visit to Mrs. Patterson's garden, the silent language of care was written in the gentle eyes of a dog who refused to let fear rule his heart. Before we continue to unravel the deeper secrets behind Charlie's behavior and the unseen threat that spurred his actions, take a moment to reflect on the remarkable ties that bind us to our animal companions. The truth was beginning to emerge, and the story promised even more astonishing revelations as each new day brought further clues. It all started with an eerie feeling that something was off. Mrs. Patterson had just finished her evening routine, turning off the lights, settling into her favorite chair with a book, and listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. But something was missing. Her house, usually filled with the gentle purring of her kittens, was silent. Too silent. She set her book down, her heart drumming in her chest as she scanned the room. Only one kitten curled up on the windowsill, its tiny body rising and falling in peaceful slumber. The others were gone. Again, a sinking feeling took hold of her. This wasn't the first time it had happened, but it was becoming more frequent. Every time she looked away, another kitten would vanish. And each time, no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no open doors or windows. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. Determined to get to the bottom of this, she grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside into the cool night air. The garden, usually a place of comfort and warmth, now felt foreign, unfamiliar. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional flicker of shadows made her uneasy. Then, a movement. At first, it was barely noticeable. A flicker of motion near the hedge at the far end of the yard. She squinted into the darkness, and there, just beyond the beam of her flashlight, was Charlie. The large dog stood frozen, his head low, his ears alert, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She took a cautious step forward. "Charlie," she whispered, her voice trembling. Charlie didn't move. He just stood there, staring. Then, as if realizing he had been caught, he turned and disappeared into the bushes. Mrs. Patterson's heart pounded. Was Charlie the reason her kittens were vanishing? Was he? No, she couldn't even bring herself to finish that thought. He had always been a gentle dog, known for his loyalty. But the facts were undeniable. He had been lurking nearby every time a kitten disappeared. Without hesitation, she followed. The garden felt endless in the darkness. and the damp earth beneath her feet only added to the tension. She carefully pushed past the thick foliage, her flashlight flickering against the overgrown leaves. Then she saw it, a small opening beneath the fence, barely large enough for a cat to squeeze through. It was partially covered by loose branches, as if someone, or something, had tried to conceal it. Her breath hitched. Had Charlie been sneaking into her yard? Had he been taking her kitten somewhere? Swallowing her fear, she pressed forward, stepping through the narrow gap. And that's when she saw them. In the hidden space between two large bushes, curled together in a makeshift nest of leaves and soft fabric scraps, were all of her missing kittens. Every single one. Safe, warm, sleeping, and lying beside them, curled protectively around their tiny bodies, was Charlie. Mrs. Patterson gasped. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Why had he taken them? What was he protecting them from? As if sensing her presence, Charlie lifted his head and looked up at her. His expression wasn't one of guilt or fear. It was something else entirely. A quiet understanding. A plea. Then she saw it. A deep, jagged scratch ran along Charlie's side, fresh and red against his golden fur. It wasn't just a scrape, it was a wound, and it had come from something with claws. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just Charlie acting on some strange impulse. He had been fighting something, defending the kittens, protecting them. Suddenly, the truth became clear. Charlie hadn't stolen the kittens. He had saved them. Mrs. Patterson felt her knees weaken as she slowly crouched down, her hand reaching toward the dog who had been accused of wrongdoing. He didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a soft, tired sigh as if relieved that she finally understood. She gently touched his fur, her fingers brushing over the scratch. "Oh, Charlie," she murmured. A rustling sound behind her made her stiffen. She turned her head sharply, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The bushes trembled, their leaves shifting as if something big, was moving just beyond her sight. Charlie immediately lifted his head, his body tensing. Mrs. Patterson held her breath. Something was still out there, something dangerous, and Charlie had known all along. She looked back at the kittens, their tiny bodies rising and falling in peaceful slumber. They had no idea how close they had come to harm. Charlie had sensed the threat before anyone else, and instead of waiting, instead of barking for help, he had done what no one else had. He had taken action. He had risked his safety to keep them out of danger. Mrs. Patterson swallowed the lump in her throat. She had almost doubted him. The neighborhood had whispered about him, questioned his actions. And yet, all along, he had been the hero. The bushes rustled again, louder this time. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the night. Charlie was on his feet now, his stance firm, his gaze locked onto the shadows beyond. Mrs. Patterson didn't need to see what was out there to know it was real. She could feel it, the same presence Charlie had felt all this time. Something had been lurking, watching, waiting, and Charlie had been the only one brave enough to face it. Her grip on the flashlight tightened. The kittens stirred in their sleep. The night was far from over, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid, because now she understood. Charlie wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, and whatever was out there, he wasn't going to let it win. As the days turned into weeks, the neighborhood began to adjust to the new reality of Charlie's brave rescue mission. Mrs. Patterson carefully observed the new resting place of her kittens, tucked away safely behind a thick, leafy bush. The kittens now thrived in a sheltered corner of her garden. Their playful mews and soft purrs reassured her that they were out of harm's way. Still, a quiet curiosity lingered in her heart. She wondered about the unknown threat that had once prowled near her home and how Charlie had sensed danger long before anyone else. For many in the community, Charlie had transformed from a misunderstood pet to a symbol of loyalty and silent heroism. Neighbors recounted tales of his unwavering vigilance. Every time he wandered near the hidden corner, his eyes would focus as if he was guarding a secret. Their whispers now spoke not of mischief, but of an ancient instinct that compelled him to protect the vulnerable. In every retelling, the same sense of mystery emerged. What unseen force had driven Charlie to act in such a careful, deliberate way? A local animal behavior expert was soon invited to weigh in on the peculiar circumstances. The expert explained that animals sometimes develop heightened senses after a traumatic event, and in Charlie's case, this could have been the result of his early accident. While the expert's words offered some comfort, they also deepened the puzzle. Could there be a link between Charlie's past and his extraordinary abilities? The community found itself caught between scientific explanation and the stirring of old legends, tales of guardian animals who rise in times of great peril. Late one evening, as twilight faded into darkness, Mrs. Patterson sat quietly on her porch. She recalled the earlier days of worry when her kittens had vanished. Now, with the knowledge of Charlie's true intentions, her gratitude mingled with lingering concern. What if the danger that Charlie sensed was not completely gone? What if there were other hidden threats still stalking the quiet streets of their neighborhood? The soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant, subtle sounds of nocturnal life provided a backdrop to these thoughts. A sense of suspense filled the air, a feeling that something was still amiss. Charlie, ever watchful, often roamed at night with a purposeful stride, his gaze sometimes fixed on distant corners of the street, as if he was waiting for a sign of trouble. His owner noticed this and began to wonder if there was more to his nightly missions than anyone had yet realized. As the community slowly began to settle into a rhythm of cautious optimism, a startling message arrived at Mrs. Patterson's door. A letter from a concerned neighbor reported seeing unfamiliar figures lurking near the edge of the neighborhood. The note hinted at unusual activity and a disturbance in areas that had long been peaceful. The words in the letter were brief but heavy with implication. It spoke of shadows moving with intent and an eerie silence that fell over the area during the late hours. Mrs. Patterson read the letter over and over, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. The thought that the unknown threat might return sent shivers down her spine. At that very moment, Charlie appeared by her side, his expression serious and alert. His presence was a silent promise that he would not let danger harm those he cared for. Yet, his vigilant eyes seemed to ask a question that hung in the air. What would come next? In that tense moment, with the letter clutched in her hand and Charlie standing guard, the mystery deepened. The hidden threat, once thought to be behind the kitten's disappearance, now loomed as a new and unsettling possibility. What secret would the night reveal next?